From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Fadi Nassar, US-Lebanon Fellow at MEI and Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution at the Lebanese American University. In today's episode, we will focus on the unraveling Hezbollah-Israel conflict, the role of the Lebanese Armed Forces during this critical moment, and the prospects of a political solution in Lebanon and the wider region. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. I'm joined today by two esteemed guests, General Khalil Helou and Dr. Paul Salem. General Khalil Helou is a retired brigadier general in the Lebanese army and a notable figure in Lebanon and strong advocate of the country's democracy and sovereignty. His service includes significant engagements during the Lebanese Civil War and the intense 2006 conflict against jihadist forces in the Nahr al-Bared refugee camp. Dr. Paul Salem is the Vice President for International Engagement at MEI. He served previously as MEI's President and CEO. He is currently based in the Middle East and works on building partnerships throughout the region. He previously held the position of Founding Director at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut from 2006 to 2013, and before that, he directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Thank you both for being with us during this critical moment.
Thank you, Dr. Nassar. Thank you, Nick. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, General Helou and Dr. Salem, first, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be with us during a time of conflict. So I thought I could open the floor, have a free discussion, and maybe we can just walk our audience through this series of rapid military developments in Lebanon. We saw attacks on the communication devices of Hezbollah members, the systematic assassination of Hezbollah's leadership, escalating bombardment across the country, and now news of Israeli troops crossing the border. I was wondering perhaps if we could start with a very human question. How are you? And could you help our audience better understand the security, political, and social situation in Lebanon against the backdrop of such shocks?
Thank you, Nick. I will start by having a comprehensive approach about the military situation. Then, if time permits, I may go into the problem of displaced persons. These are the two major things. And then the government's position. The military situation could be summarized as follows. Israel is concentrating the strikes over the southern suburbs of Beirut. This means the headquarters of Hezbollah. Already, the headquarters have been attacked. The intelligence of Hezbollah has been attacked. The financial institution has been also attacked, and also the media of Hezbollah, the media office. And these strikes are continuous, sustained, and the Israeli Air Force is forbidding any attempt to rescue, to search for victims in the targeted areas of southern suburbs of Beirut. And for the time being, while we are discussing, there are surveillance UAVs over Beirut, over all the area, watching and scrutinizing the region. So there is a strike on the head. And this means it is a comprehensive war. It's not a matter of incursion in South Lebanon only. In the northern Bekaa, in Baalbek and Hermel, and even in Syria, the Israeli Air Force are continuously striking what they designate as weapon stores or weapon facilities of Hezbollah, majorly the long-range missiles, the precision-guided missiles that are stored in Baalbek and Hermel, or presumably stored there because their range is over 250 kilometers. So logically, they couldn't be stored in South Lebanon close to the border or in the central Bekaa. So the head, and then the logistics, the major logistical part, and then what's going on in South Lebanon since 10 days after the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, after all the things you mentioned, what is unfolding is the following. The Israeli infiltration till now, all over the 70 kilometers of border, is carried out by special forces and special operations. They are trying to match what they are recognizing on the ground with their previously assessed information through satellites, through aircrafts, through UAVs or human intelligence. And this is the first phase of presumed infiltration or by land forces, by infantry, by tanks. But what they are doing is they are, about the Israelis, they are trying to locate the tunnels. They sent some videos showing some tunnels with weapons, with facilities, with intelligence information, and so on. And they say they are sustaining this operation. And it is conducted by a special unit of the Israeli army. Now, knowing that there are at least 5 divisions concentrated on our border, and these 5 divisions are huge regarding the area. But I think that the Israelis don't want to be catched by an anti-tank fire that Hezbollah is excellent in manipulating, exactly like the Russian troops suffered casualties while they were invading Ukraine. It would be the same problem here. Now, for Hezbollah, despite all the losses they suffered, it seems that the chain of command and control has been restored, maybe partially, maybe totally, but it is efficient because they are firing precision guided missiles from the northern part of the Bekaa. And this type of weapon is under the orders of a central command, not of regional command. For example, in South Lebanon, the regional command of Hezbollah in South Lebanon is on its own. They have their own stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, life support facilities, and so on. They can operate by themselves. They don't need the central command in order to defend their positions. But firing missiles like the types that have been fired on Haifa for 3 days, 3 consecutive days, needs a central decision. So this central chain of command seems to have been restored. The fighting in South Lebanon is defensive fighting. They are using all sorts of ambushes. Israeli troops fell into a big ambush in the region of Adaisi, and 5 or 6 improvised explosive devices in Bint Jbeil and Maroun al-Ras. There are casualties in the ranks of the Israeli army. So this is what's going on. Now, we cannot, let's say, forecast what is the real military objective of the Israelis. Is it only to push back Hezbollah from the border or to degrade Hezbollah to the maximum? Or more than that, it is too early to forecast.
Well noted, thank you. And it really gave us a great insight into the security situation that is uncertain but certainly escalating. But perhaps it gives me this opportunity to turn to you, Dr. Salem. Could you give us a sense of the scenes we're seeing in Beirut? I mean, and across the country, we hear reports of more than 1 million people displaced. And it forces me to ask the question, who can the Lebanese turn to in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, since 3 weeks ago, it's been a very, very dramatic situation. I mean, obviously, for the year before that, there had been armed conflict across the border between Hezbollah and Israel, but it was limited to a narrow area in southern Lebanon and a fairly narrow area in northern Israel. Since basically September 17, the pager attacks, and then the very major aerial attacks on the south, and then the southern suburbs and the northern Bekaa. Yes, there's been about 1 million people who have moved from those 3 areas. Also, other parts of Beirut have been partially emptied because Beirut in general has become very scary. And this is happening at a time when Hezbollah is really not present for their people. I mean, these are mainly the supportive community of Hezbollah, some of their own partisans, but also just the Shiite community in general, as well as others. And it's remarkable that Hezbollah is really not present to help them or to support them in any meaningful way. And at the same time, the Lebanese state is barely present to provide aid as well. As you know, the Lebanese state has been without a president for 2 years, has been with a caretaker prime minister and government, and the economy already collapsed 5 years ago. But I do think what is remarkable is that the Lebanese people, Lebanese villages, municipalities, schools, churches, mosques, and so on, that there's been a real civil society, let's call it generally, embrace and people trying their best to help everybody out. I think that is a very positive development. Of course, there's problems here and there, and they get amplified by social media. But I'm speaking to you today in the north, and the number of people from the south, from the southern suburbs, who are living here with great support from the local populations is very important and very heartwarming. And that might indicate other political possibilities down the road.
That's a very important point, and it helps me transition to you, General Helou. We're at war, people are lost, they are scared, they are displaced. How is the Lebanese Armed Forces' current response to the war perceived locally? Are there growing aspirations for them to take a more prominent role, or is there increasing concern regarding its performance?
Well, Nick, let me have a comprehensive approach on that issue by going back 15 years ago. All the Lebanese governments that succeeded themselves one by one, all of them recognized the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that stipulates to stop the war, to stop the Israeli incursions by air and sea and land, and the withdrawal of Hezbollah from south of the Litani River. So all the governments recognized this resolution, but in the meantime, there was a schizophrenia within these governments because at the same time, they recognized the right of Hezbollah to arm and to resist and so on. So Lebanese armed forces were facing, let's say, an uneasy situation. They were left on their own to decide what to do. If they wanted to implement the 1701 by force, that meant a civil war, and this is not an option. Otherwise, they had to manage security, stability, and the limitation of damages case by case, it's a case by case situation. So this is what was the option of the successive commanders in chief of the Lebanese army, because the government was not fulfilling its role on that issue. Usually, the army should follow the government's instructions that should be clear, with a clear view, a clear strategy, and a clear vision. That was not the case. So the army was left alone to take the proper decisions on the case by case. Now, this war has been opened by Hezbollah, and Hezbollah did not consult neither the army nor the government and did not try to shape or build up a national consensus over the opening of this war. That is, we are now in the second year of this war. So the Lebanese army was not consulted, and now they want, some people in Lebanon want the Lebanese army to resist to Israel or by other means to commit suicide. So let's go straight to the options. Whether this war finishes by an Israeli invasion or by negotiations, the role of the army will come inevitably after that war. The best option for Lebanon, for Hezbollah themselves, for the international community, and for the Arab community in the Middle East is the deployment of the Lebanese army in South Lebanon. And to deploy this army in South Lebanon, this army should continue to exist, should continue to be operational, should continue to adopt the same attitude adopted all over these years. Some people blame the army because it did not crossfire with Hezbollah or did not fight Hezbollah or push Hezbollah back to the Litani. I already said this means civil war. And some others are blaming the army why they are not resisting Israel. Now, when Israel has a military budget of $20 billion per year, with all this huge US military aids for this year, only more than 20 billion, and our military budget is 2 billion. So I said this would be suicide. And then we don't defend Lebanon only with tanks, with airplanes, and with weapons. We defend Lebanon also by diplomacy. The priority is to restore our friendship among the free world, the United States, Europe, and to restore our good relations with the Arab countries. This would be much more efficient than asking the army to fight Israel in a war that is lost before it starts. So the army should be preserved, and this is how Lebanese people see this army. They are supporting this army, they are confident to this army, and this army today is protecting the displaced people from South Lebanon that are now dispersed all over Lebanon. The army is preventing, let's say, security problems, is preventing frictions, and everyone is confident to this army, either the Hezbollah supporters or the Hezbollah opponents. So this army should preserve its role this way.
Thank you. That's very enlightening. It'll allow me to give you just one quick follow up. Do you see the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, playing a role in any solution moving forward?
Of course, the army is the solution. Hezbollah was the problem, and the army would be the solution. No one will send troops to South Lebanon. Already, you have 10 to 12,000 UNIFIL troops coming from different countries. I don't think that any country has the appetite to send their children to South Lebanon in order to be targeted by Israel or by Hezbollah or by any other force. So the natural role of the Lebanese army is to play this role of buffer in South Lebanon to implement the United Nations Security Resolution 1701 that says clearly that the army should deploy in South Lebanon and should restore the state's sovereignty there and is helped by UNIFIL. So this is the role that we want our army to play after the end of the conflict.
Well, that's very insightful. I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Salem, and just ask, we got this great walk through history and comparison that General Helou gave us. So I want to ask this formula, a lot of it emerged after 2006, the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, of UNIFIL playing a role, of the army playing a role. But we're back in a state of conflict. So I thought maybe I'd ask two questions. Is it time for a new playbook to be used in Washington for a final solution so that we won't see another breakout of conflict between Israel and Lebanon in the future? And the second one, perhaps, is there a difference? Are you noticing a difference in the type of government that we saw in 2006 that arguably was advocating on behalf of Lebanon, on behalf of Lebanon's interests, versus this current caretaker government today?
Well, I think the situation is definitely very different today than it was in 2006. And the major difference is on the Israeli side, I would say, that after the attacks of October 7, they no longer themselves tolerated the status quo that had maintained stability and peace on the Israeli-Lebanese border from 2006 to 2023. That's a lot of years. And Hamas upset that seeming equilibrium. And as you know, Israel from very early on wanted to launch an attack on Hezbollah early in the war, but the United States talked them out of it. So they faced Hamas first, devastated Gaza and everything that happened there, and then turned to Hezbollah only 3 weeks ago. Israel is no longer, certainly has no trust in the United Nations. I'm talking about this Israeli government, has no trust in this Lebanese government or probably any future Lebanese government, has no trust in Hezbollah anymore. Keep in mind, Netanyahu trusted Hamas and Hezbollah for many years until they surprised him, and then he and many Israelis decided otherwise. So there doesn't currently seem to be the elements of a clear way to negotiate an end to this conflict right now, because the elements would be bring in the Lebanese government, bring in the Lebanese army, talk to Hezbollah, which is what the US envoy was doing, Amos Hochstein, and finding arrangements for the border, different deployments, and so on. But Israel, I think, has gone beyond that. More importantly, after Israel feels that it has scored probably what they feel is a surprisingly quick victory to a large degree over Hezbollah. Yes, it survives. Yes, it can still fight, but it's nothing like it was 3-4 weeks ago. And as you can see, Israel is now focusing on striking Iran directly. And Iran is very worried that it has lost its main deterrent, which was always Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is now fighting for its own life and no longer able to deter Israel. Iran is now forced to try to deter Israel itself by launching missiles from Iran itself. And I think the fight has moved on directly to Israel and Iran. And that is where we will see where this entire war, because it's really a war at this point between Israel and Iran, Hezbollah is a part of it. And I think, how that war goes, then we will understand weeks, months from now, how Lebanon may or may not end. It's very, very significant that in the last few days, Nabih Berri, the Speaker of Parliament, the most close person to Hassan Nasrallah, at least outside of Hezbollah previously, and close to Hezbollah, speaking for the Shiite duo, as they usually were called, and the Prime Minister Najib Mikati both said that Hassan Nasrallah had agreed to a separate ceasefire, or that Hezbollah today was ready to accept a ceasefire separate from Gaza. And it took a special visit by the Iranian foreign minister to land in Beirut and tell the Lebanese government, and I'm sure tell Hezbollah, that no, you keep on fighting until we tell you otherwise. So that's where we are, and we will have to see what happens between Iran and Israel in the next few days, and then pick up the pieces as to what is doable.
If you allow me to break things down for our audience in a very simple way, key resolutions like UN Resolution 1559, 1701, that a lot of times we can hear in the debate on Lebanon, together really have three key sort of elements. One is the withdrawal of all Israeli troops and foreign troops from Lebanon. The second is that all militias should disarm, with a big emphasis on Hezbollah. And the third, of course, is that the Lebanese government, and by extension, the Lebanese Armed Forces, should have sole control over all its territory. What I want to open to both of you, is that formula on the table? Can the United States in particular play a role in seeing it pushed in a way that wasn't successful in 2006?
Well, if I make a quick answer and then turn to General Helou, let me first say I think the US has been very proactive. Amos Hochstein has been very proactive, and the French have been active as well. But I think one must recognize the support of US diplomacy to try to avoid the war. And we're very thankful for that. Also, to be very clear that the US has been the biggest supporter to the Lebanese army, to the Lebanese economy and humanitarian situation. Having said all of that, I think the United States does not have the capacity to determine the key element of what you just said, which is whether Hezbollah agrees to disarm itself or not. Nobody's going to, as General Helou said, nobody wants a civil war to try to disarm it by force. Other Lebanese militias, when the war ended, disarmed by agreement and willingly, and Hezbollah did not, with support from the Assad regime and from the Iranians. Right now, as I just indicated, I think that decision is not in the hands of Lebanese Hezbollah, it's in the hands of Tehran and Iran. Tehran has lost Hamas really as a fighting force, has lost much of Hezbollah as a deterrent, and is about to be at war itself. So whether it enters negotiations as Iran in the next few months, and whether it offers that concession on the table relating to whether it's the Houthi militias or the Hezbollah, that is probably something that may or may not happen on that level. The US could be involved in those negotiations, but cannot impose it. I'd love to hear General Helou's views.
Yes, well, Paul, I don't want to add anything over what you said, but I want just to make some things clear. In the situation where we are as government, as people, this war situation, the social situation, we have to stick to the legal texts we have. First of all, our constitution. And I will get back to that if I have time. And then the United Nations Security Council resolutions, even if they have not been implemented, they give us a legal coverage to recover our sovereignty, internal sovereignty vis-a-vis the militias, the 1559. The 1701 gives us a legal guarantee to our sovereignty vis-a-vis of Israel, even though 18 years, since 18 years till now, this United Nations Security Resolution has not been fully implemented. And the 1680 United Nations Security Resolution give us a guarantee sovereignty vis-a-vis Syria. So we have to stick to these texts. They are issued from the international community, and we can use them as milestones or as a vision for the future, because we cannot invent new resolutions or new solutions. It is very simple. The state of Lebanon exists. It has a constitution. It is in instability. We have problems. So we have to get back to what has been already written and implemented once and proven that it may succeed. So this is what I have to say. We cannot be inventors of new solutions. The solution is very simple. Lebanon is a small country. The data is well known by anyone. So that's it.
Great. Well, I want to then shift to something you mentioned, Dr. Salem, about the regional context. So, if you were in the White House right now, you're observing these rapid developments, the decapitation of Hezbollah, the onset of what could be a very major ground invasion. We still don't know what it will look like. The escalating overall conflict you mentioned between Iran and Israel, and an underlying battle over the regional balance of power. What strategic goals would you set, and what policy tools would you consider?
Well, it's clear that the Biden administration has not been able to shape Israel's decisions for this entire year. And I am shocked. And not in a partisan way. I have a lot of respect for President Biden, but this is almost a dereliction of duty that the United States, which is a superpower, which is obviously the main supporter of Israel, has accepted time and time again to be dictated to by Prime Minister Netanyahu, to be humiliated, to be immediately contradicted, to go exactly against recommendations or requests from the Biden administration. So at this point, I think the Biden administration has very little leverage and very little respect, unfortunately, from the Netanyahu government. However, well, I think we've seen this obviously in Gaza, we saw it on the West Bank, and we saw it in Lebanon. West Bank is also in a very horrible condition. But it's an important point to say that in those three arenas, Israel did not really need US military support. Yes, it welcomes the billions of dollars, the support, but it didn't militarily need it. Israel is now focused on trying to stop Iran's nuclear program and to try to hit Iran very, very hard. Israel cannot hit Iran's nuclear program in a major way without the US hitting it for them. They can hit some reactors and some bases, but the main bases are too deep underground, and Israel does not have the bombs and does not have the bombers that can deliver those blows. Only the US has them. So, in this conflict that Israel is trying to mount on Iran, yes, what the Biden administration decides to do or not to do does make a difference. But regardless of what the US does or does not say, I think the margin now is the Biden administration is negotiating with the Israelis what they're going to hit and trying to convince them, one, not to hit the nuclear sites. And I think they're also trying to convince them not to hit the oil and energy sites because they're afraid then Iran would hit the Saudi and Emirati and other Gulf sites and send the American economy and the global economy into a recession. And they might be at least coming to a sense that, well, maybe if Israel hits some military sites, some missile sites, some intelligence sites, that would be somewhat proportional because Iran didn't hit Israeli military bases near Tel Aviv. So I think that's where we are. I think the Biden administration has really been very much missing in action. I know they've been quote unquote trying, but this is not how a superpower tries. And this is not how a superpower influences a client or a junior partner like Israel. And I recall when President Reagan had differences with President Begin in the 82 invasion, it went very differently. When President Eisenhower had differences with Israel during the Suez War, it ended very differently. But sadly, we have seen no strength in the US position. And hence, I'm very worried that Israel would proceed to do much of what it wants to do. And that puts much of the region at risk. But I will also want to say Iran has been very happy to fight Israel through Arabs and very unhappy to fight Israel through Iranians and through losses to Iran itself. So this is a new chapter for the Islamic Republic. They know that most of their population doesn't like them. They know that they have a very difficult internal situation. How will they feel if they are under military attack and they drag their people into war as Hezbollah dragged the Lebanese into war? I bet they're very worried about that.
Thank you for sharing, that regional perspective. I know much of our audience is also tuning in to get a better idea on Lebanon. So I want to turn to you, General Helou. You told us the solution is straightforward. But I'm going to press on that because if it were so straightforward, we wouldn't be at war again. Do you see a way out where Lebanon, its state, its economy, and its people survive this war?
Well, I just want to stress on one point. Modern Lebanon exists since 1920. And the mosaic of the Lebanese population is very diverse, and it is there since 10 centuries. It's not new. So these communities lived together in peace most of the time. They fought each other several times, but each time there was a solution in the end, and life together got back peacefully. So this is one hope. And the modern state of Lebanon that has been founded in 1920 exists in the hearts and minds of several generations. You know, you have the extremists, you have the fundamentalists, you have people who want to divide the country, you have people who want to change the constitution. All that is sort of imagination because in the current situation, any attempt to change the current constitution is nearly a suicide or a jump in the unknown. So I think that I already said we have to stick to what exists and try to restore it and rebuild it. Now, do we have chance to recover economically? Yes, once stability is restored, let's say the individual initiative in Lebanon permits restoration of the economy more or less. But to restore stability, once again, there is no other solution than the Lebanese army that has proven that it didn't divide facing all the problems we had since 2000 till now. We had the first experience after the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. The army didn't divide. We had the experience in the Nahar al-Bared war against Al-Qaeda, no desertions. The army was coherent. They fought like lions. It's the third experience in 2017 against ISIS. So no desertions. And now facing this dilemma between Israel and Hezbollah, the attitude of the army is supported by many people. So we need the support of the international community to get out of the situation, or at least have a roadmap that is concentrated on the restoration of the Lebanese state and mainly all the institutions, the governmental institutions that should be protected by the Lebanese army. So there is a great hope, and this hope maintained Lebanon for the past half century, where from a war to another, every time we were ending with a comprehensive, let's say, I'm not saying solution, but a negotiation that ended with stability and attempts to restore the Lebanese state.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. And it gives me this opportunity to turn to you, Dr. Salem. And I'm going to point our audience to a long form article that was also a very personal article that you wrote for the Middle East, where you reflect on the Levant and you asked a deeply personal but pressing question: what broke the Levant and can it be fixed? Now, one key obstacle you highlighted, and I know it was towards the end of your comments in your last intervention, was the strategic posture of Iran in the Levant that was destabilizing the region. I know you gave some strong words on this administration, but perhaps if you're advising a new administration, is there room in DC for you to propose ways to win the political day after?
Well, as I said in that article, and I said again in an article that's coming out tomorrow, the two master conflicts that have bedeviled Lebanon and bedeviled the Levant, as they say, and much of the Middle East, the two master conflicts are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for a century now. And since the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran and since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran's decision that in order to avoid war in Iran or on Iran, it's going to build a forward defense and build armies in Arab countries. And the model for that was Lebanon, build a big army there to counter Israel and behind it the US, build militias in Yemen, build militias in Syria and Iraq, build militias in the Gaza Strip. I proposed in that article, and I propose it again, and it's something I would propose to any policymaker in the US or otherwise, that the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which just erupted again a year ago, Netanyahu and the right wing think that simply by putting occupation on steroids, that that's going to work. That 7 million Jewish Israelis oppressing and dominating 7 million Arab Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians for the rest of the 21st century, that's going to work great. That's going to be peaceful. And so that is nonsense. Netanyahu does not have a plan for the day after, the week after, the year after. And he is simply reacting to, yes, a horrific attack by Hamas by doing a much worse attack on the Gaza Strip. There has to be movement towards some form of two-state solution. Many sober Israelis know that and have known it for a long time. Now you have major Arab partners who are saying, look, Israel, we are eager to normalize with you, make life normal, but you've got to give the Palestinians their national rights. The same is being said by the Biden and Harris administration. Trump obviously does not say that. He doesn't really believe in it. Now, so any next US administration should try to move in that direction. But frankly, I think it's up to the Israeli public and Israeli leaders to realize that they're digging their hole deeper and deeper. And it's also up to Arab leaders, like Sadat did and others, to grapple with the Israelis and wake them up and say, look, this is not the way to go. The second master conflict is this conflict with Iran's concept of defense. Everybody respects Iran's right to defend itself 100%, but countries should defend themselves behind their borders. This nonsense of Iran taking the imperial prerogative that it can put militias wherever it wants has destroyed Lebanon or participated in the continued destruction of Lebanon, obstacles in Yemen, in Iraq, which is trying to build a state, but it can't. Syria continues to be in shambles. Whether Iran, President Pezeshkian, I know most of the Iranian public doesn't want this nonsense anymore, but the IRGC and the hardliners are still investing in this strategy. If we could get through negotiation or through something else to a point where we have a resolution to the Palestinian question, which should not be rocket science, and a retreat by Iran from this policy of building armies in other people's countries, I think Lebanon and much of the Middle East and Iran and Israel would have a much better future.
Thank you. A lot of stuff to unpack there, and I want to end it with a question for both of you. General Helou, we'll start with you. I want to ask just a very simple question, although I can imagine the answer will be complex. Is there hope for a sovereign Lebanon? And what does that look like for you coming out of this conflict?
Well, yes, there is hope. A lot of Lebanese from different communities are struggling for this sovereign Lebanon. All of the previous fighters who fought each other got matured during this period. The young generation maybe knows that or not, but I belong to this generation where we fought each other 50 years ago. We got matured. We are contacting each other. People who fought each other are working now hand to hand in order to recover the Lebanon I talked about, the Lebanon of 1920, of the constitution, the current constitution. And I want just to stress on a point. This constitution is now 96 years old, or maybe, yes, 98 years old, or 96 years old. And it resisted all attempts to take it out. It has been amended twice, but it didn't change anything about the share power within the government or the parliament or else. The balance of power outside these institutions was prevailing because of weaponry. Now, if the sovereignty of the state is recovered, and this is what we are struggling for, I am very hopeful that Lebanon will get back to what it was in the 50s and the 60s of the past century.
I'll just ask a quick follow-up because you brought something very interesting. Is there some form of concrete international support that can help in that direction at this moment?
Of course, of course. Already the United States, as Paul mentioned, provided a valuable umbrella to keep the Lebanese army from being attacked by Israel, and provided an umbrella for keeping the infrastructure from being bombarded by Israel in 2006 and now. And the second thing is that the continuous logistical help and the support for the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, by the United States should continue in order to keep it on the chessboard as an option and to keep the balance of power between the LAF and other armed forces, illegal or militias in Lebanon.
Thank you. Dr. Salem, I want to turn to you. You gave us, a very wide regional framework where there are these two sort of poles drifting the region apart. You also painted the picture of a rather reluctant, at least US administration at the moment. I want to ask a question I keep hearing in Washington and give you the opportunity perhaps to make your case. Should Lebanon matter to the United States, and to what extent?
Well, yes, I think it should matter. I think it already matters. The US Congress has supported Lebanon, the Lebanese army, throughout many, many phases. Almost all successive US administrations have. The State Department has, the Department of Defense. So, one thing one can say, it's a proven fact that the US government and its Congress, and to a large degree its media themselves, think Lebanon has worth. I'm not saying it's a huge interest and a huge thing. No, it's a rather minor country, but it is also one which the US has already demonstrated for many, many decades that it matters. And I'll unpack that a bit. It matters, first of all, politically, in the sense that the Lebanese community in America is a very old community, very successful. So many Americans are Lebanese. So when you say Lebanon in America, it's not completely a foreign country, because there's a lot of Lebanese that most Americans know. Secondly, the history of the US culturally with Lebanon through the American University of Beirut, Lebanese American University, many Americans who came to Lebanon over the decades who fell in love with the country or studied in the country. There's also that relationship. If we look at the military relationship, to get to hard facts, the US military has great respect for the Lebanese army. And I think, reflecting what General Helou said, man to man, the Department of Defense says maybe Emirati special forces are a bit better than Lebanese special forces, but the US military has great respect for the fighting abilities and the ingenuity of Lebanese officers and Lebanese soldiers with the little resources that they have. And the US military is very aware that the Lebanese army played a very important role in pushing Al Qaeda out of the country, in pushing ISIS out of the country. They're also very aware that the Lebanese army cannot and should not directly try to fight Hezbollah, because that would unravel the army and cause civil war. But they're also very aware, as General Helou said, that they maintain a balance of power, they maintain stability, they maintain an option for Lebanon other than the Hezbollah option. And politically, I think the US Embassy, the US State Department, and US presidents have all shown a long term commitment to Lebanon. So, yes, it matters. It also matters generally because, not to be put too fine a point on it, it's next to Israel, and a lot of Americans care about Israel, so that matters. It's on the Eastern Mediterranean, there's offshore gas issues that relate to Europe, that matters. And Lebanon also is right next to Syria, where you have ISIS, Al Qaeda, the Russian army, the Iranian special force, IRGC, and so on. So there are many ways that Lebanon is important to the United States, and I'll leave it at that. I would say that what we want from the US, which it has not been able to do, Lebanon, and I think the whole world, wanted from the US to deliver a ceasefire in Gaza. We are well aware that had there been a ceasefire in Gaza, there would have been a ceasefire in Lebanon. We would have avoided this latest horror of killing and displacement and utter destruction of a third of the country had that ceasefire in Gaza been agreed to. And we also ask and demand now that a ceasefire be put in place in Lebanon to stop the devastation and destruction and to find an alternative way forward other than more invasions, more destruction, more loss of life, and more misery.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Salem. I want to thank you, General Helou, and I want to thank our audience for the time that you've spent with us and joining our program. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of Lebanon on our website at www.mei.edu. That's unfortunately all the time we have for this week. Thank you again to our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast producer, Elliot Sanders, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.